Welcome to Revenge Report. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let's dive in. I had spent months preparing for this moment, months of planning, organizing, and sacrificing. But there I was, stepping into the grand hall for the prestigious recognition event, feeling like a fish out of water. The room was buzzing with laughter, the clink of champagne glasses, and the low hum of conversation. All around me, people in expensive suits and sparkling gowns circled the room, exchanging hollow pleasantries. My name is Colonel ELARA Monroe. I'm retired now, but even in my 50s, my service in the military still defined me in some ways. Always quiet, always with purpose. But here, among the high society of people who made their fortunes climbing ladders built on the backs of others, I felt like an imposter. It was a far cry from the life I had known, the life I had chosen. The quiet years of service, of sacrifice, of putting my country before everything else. I didn't need recognition, didn't need applause. All I wanted was respect. But in a place like this, respect was a commodity, something earned with the right clothes, the right connections, the right image. Something I could never quite seem to grasp, no matter how many times I sacrificed for those who didn't even see me. I walked through the room, my eyes scanning for familiar faces, none of them familiar enough to feel at home. My mother was here, of course. She had made sure to be front and center for this event, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a hawk hunting for prey. And standing next to her, as usual, was my sister Clara, her hair immaculately styled, her smile perfectly poised for the cameras. They were the picture of high society. I was invisible. I found my seat in the back, far from the stage. I didn't need the spotlight. I preferred to stay out of the way, to observe. I'd learned long ago that staying in the background was safer. It was the only place I'd ever felt comfortable. Just as I settled into my chair, I heard the faintest sound, a laugh, low, mocking. My mother's voice. She was speaking to a group of people, all of them leaning in to listen to her every word. I knew exactly where this was going. "Arara," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter of the room. Always so serious. I told her, you'd think with all her years in the military, she'd at least learn to lighten up. But no. She thinks those medals and honors actually matter. I froze, my heart sinking. I didn't turn to look at her, but I could picture her perfectly. The slight tilt of her head, the smile playing on her lips as she delivered her cruel little remarks. My achievements, my years of service, my sacrifice, it meant nothing to her, to them. And the best part, she continued, as if she were telling a secret to her friends, she comes here, expecting a round of applause, but look at her. No one's even looking at her. Her laugh echoed in my mind as I sat there, my hands gripping the edges of my chair. I felt the heat of humiliation flush my cheeks, but I wouldn't let it show. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I sat there in silence, staring at the center of the room, my heart thumping in my chest. It was the same as it had always been. No matter how much I had done for this family, I would always be less, always too serious, too rigid, too different. But in that moment, as the laughter and the mocking words washed over me, I made a choice. I would not confront her, not now, not here, in front of all these people. But I would remember it. I would carry it with me, as I had carried every other cruel remark, every dismissive comment. I stayed silent, focusing on the cold, tight knot in my chest. The years of service had taught me many things, but the hardest lesson had been this. Sometimes, the silence was the loudest scream. I sat there, still and composed, watching the event unfold around me. The clinking of glasses, the hushed laughter, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. I had long since stopped paying attention to the speeches and the flow of conversation around me. My mind was too busy with thoughts of the past, of battles fought, both on the field and within my own family. I wasn't meant to be here, at least that's what it felt like sometimes. I had learned to live in the background, to keep my presence to a minimum. But tonight was supposed to be different. It wasn't about me, not really. This was about the recognition, the acknowledgement of a life lived in service. But for me, standing on that stage, accepting that applause, was never the point. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. The ceremony continued, the atmosphere growing more electric as the evening wore on. A buzz of excitement and anticipation rippled through the crowd. The president of the event, a tall, sharply dressed man with an air of arrogance about him, took the stage. He was a stranger to me, just like most of the people here. As he spoke, I felt the familiar weight of being invisible creeping back into my bones. He talked about sacrifice, about courage, about standing up in the face of adversity. For a moment, I thought he was speaking directly to me, but I quickly shook the thought away. I wasn't here for that. Next, we have someone whose name is synonymous with leadership and commitment, a true hero who has served this country with honor. The president paused, glancing down at his notes. The room fell quiet, a hushed reverence filling the space. And now, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for the evening, Colonel ELARA Monroe. The words hung in the air for a moment before they landed in my chest like a weight. My name echoed in the room, a sharp contrast to the silence that followed. A moment of confusion rippled through the crowd before it started to shift. Whispers, muted gasps. I stood slowly, feeling my knee twinge in protest as I rose to my feet. It had been years since the injury, and yet the pain still crept up on me like an old friend. I ignored it, just as I had ignored it for years. The moment I stood, I felt the eyes of the room on me, expectant, curious, perhaps even judgmental. The sting of being out of place was familiar, but sharper now, the silence ringing louder than the applause that was beginning to swell, slow and uncertain at first. I pushed through the pain in my knee, forcing myself to take one step, then another, moving towards the stage. The applause began to grow, tentative at first, before it gained momentum. The crowd had caught on, but the familiar sting of rejection gnawed at me. I had been there. I had fought, sacrificed, bled. And here I was, in this room, a forgotten face among the celebrated. The public recognition was nice, yes, but it felt hollow, like the walls of a place I could never truly belong. I reached the stage, feeling every step like a weight on my shoulders. There, standing before me, was the microphone, the spotlight. This was the moment I was supposed to own. But inside, all I could think of was the humiliation, the comments I'd overheard, the constant reminder that no matter how much I had done, I would always be the outsider. The president shook my hand as I took the podium, offering me a smile that was polite but distant. Colonel Monroe, thank you for your years of service. His words were meaningless to me. He didn't know me. He didn't know the weight of what I had endured. I nodded, giving him a tight smile in return, before finally turning my gaze to the crowd. The applause was steady now, but still it didn't feel real. My mother's voice, echoing in my mind, mocked me. You think those medals and honors actually matter? It was almost as if she was here with me, still pulling the strings, still reminding me that this recognition would never be enough. I gripped the podium, the moment of victory slipping through my fingers like sand. Thank you, I said, my voice steady, if not a little strained, for the recognition and for the chance to stand here tonight. And that was it. No grand speech, no lengthy words of wisdom, just silence, broken only by the polite applause of a crowd that didn't know me, didn't know the price of the medals they so casually admired. But that was the point, wasn't it? I wasn't here for them. I wasn't here for applause. I was here for the quiet strength I had built over years of service, of sacrifice, something they would never understand. And just for tonight, that was enough. The applause slowly tapered off as I stepped back from the podium, but I felt no victory, no triumph, only the quiet hum of a moment that had passed me by. As I returned to my seat, I could hear my mother's voice again in my head, her dismissive laugh, her words cutting through me like shards of glass. I sat down, still, composed, and let the silence be my shield. The night wasn't about me. It was about something deeper, something they would never know. I sat back down in my seat, trying to steady my breath, but the weight of the evening was heavier than I expected. The applause, the recognition, it all felt so hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong in this world, among these people who measured worth by appearances and shallow accomplishments. Around me, the event continued. People mingled, laughed, and congratulated each other. But I was miles away. My mind drifted to memories that had nothing to do with this room, with this night. I glanced over at my family, seated at a table not too far from where I sat. My mother, her head tilted slightly, her eyes scanning the room for someone important to talk to. My sister Clara, ever the social butterfly, laughing loudly with someone I didn't recognize. It should have been a familiar scene, but it felt distant. I was no longer part of their world. For years, I had tried to fit in, to bridge the gap between the life I had chosen and the one they so effortlessly lived. I had tried to prove to them, to myself, that my service, my sacrifice meant something. But it was never enough. I could see Clara now, her laughter almost too bright, too rehearsed. She had always been the golden child in my family, the one who effortlessly charmed everyone she met. the one who got the praise, the attention, the affection. I had been the one to do the dirty work, the one to quietly serve and sacrifice. While she smiled and played the part of the perfect daughter, I was the one who worked behind the scenes, who gave up everything for a country that didn't even know my name. And still, I had hoped. Hope that maybe, one day, they would see me for what I truly was, a person, not just a means to an end. But that hope, like everything else, had worn thin. I turned my attention back to the table. My mother had been talking to someone, her voice loud enough for me to hear. "She's always so serious," she was saying, her tone dismissive. I told her she should lighten up a bit. You'd think with all her time in the military, she'd at least learn to enjoy life. Her laugh followed, sharp and cold, and the sting of it hit me like a slap in the face. There it was again, the dismissal. The same kind of rejection that had been a constant throughout my life. I didn't need to look at Clara to know she was laughing along with her. That's how it always went. Clara was the perfect daughter, the one who could do no wrong. And I was just the odd one out, the one who didn't fit into their world of superficial perfection. It wasn't just tonight. It wasn't just the comments about me being too serious or not fitting the vibe. It was every family gathering, every holiday, every time I'd shown up in my uniform or after a long day of work, my hands still rough and calloused. That was the real reason they couldn't stand me. They could never accept that someone like me, someone who didn't care about appearances, who didn't seek recognition, could do anything worthy of respect. I could feel the old, familiar knot of anger building up in my chest. The same anger I had felt growing up, the same anger that had fueled my determination to leave. Back then, I had believed that if I just did enough, sacrificed enough, maybe, just maybe, they would see me. But now, it was clear that it wasn't about what I did. It was about who I was, and I would never fit into their world, no matter how hard I tried. A memory suddenly flooded my mind, one from when I was young. I remembered my mother's voice, sharp and cold, after a spelling bee in elementary school. I had lost. She had stood over me, her disappointment clear in her eyes. "You're not like Clara," she had said, her words cutting through me like a knife. "She's sharp. Well, you try. That counts for something, I guess." I had felt so small in that moment, like I was nothing. It wasn't just the loss, it was the way she compared me to Clara. I had never been enough, never sharp enough, never good enough. Looking at my mother now, I realized something I hadn't before. The people in my life, my family, had never really seen me for who I was. They had always compared me to Clara, always held me up to a standard that didn't even belong to me. I had outgrown the need for their validation. I had learned to accept that I would never be who they wanted me to be, and that was okay, because somewhere along the way, I had found my own worth. My service, my sacrifice, my quiet strength, those things were mine, and they didn't need anyone's approval. As the laughter continued to echo in my ears, I realized something important. I no longer needed their approval. I had stopped waiting for them to see me for who I truly was. I was more than enough, just as I was, and they would never understand that. The evening wore on, the noise of the gathering ebbing and flowing like the tide, but I felt increasingly distant from it all. The speeches, the compliments, the laughter, they felt like a world I no longer inhabited. I had always lived my life in the shadows, a quiet observer, making my contributions in ways that no one ever really saw. And that's how it had always been. That's how it would always be. As I sat there, my mind began to wander. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think back to the defining moments of my career, the quiet, unspoken sacrifices. The times I had pushed my body and my mind to their limits, knowing that there would never be applause or recognition for what I was doing. It wasn't about recognition, it had never been, but I couldn't help but wonder, was that enough? I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the room blur into the background. The crowd, the laughter, the clinking glasses, none of it mattered. What mattered were the moments that shaped me, the moments when I had truly tested my limits. One memory rose to the surface of my thoughts, sharp and clear. It was from my time in the field during one of the most difficult operations I had ever been part of. The mission had been grueling from the start, every step weighed down with danger, but nothing prepared me for what happened next. I had been injured, a severe knee injury during a critical point in the mission. We were deep in the desert, the sun beating down on us, the sand blistering against our skin. The mission wasn't finished yet. We weren't out of the danger zone. My team still needed me. But with every step, the pain in my knee grew worse. The fracture was deep, the pain blinding, and yet I kept crawling, every inch an effort. My teammates had urged me to stop, to rest, but I couldn't. I knew if I stopped, if I didn't keep pushing, we would fail. And failure wasn't an option. So I crawled through the desert, my body screaming in pain with every movement, but my mind focused only on the mission. I couldn't afford to let my injury take me down. My team needed me, and I would do whatever it took to make sure they got through this. I remembered the agony of it, the burning in my leg, the way my muscles screamed in protest, but my resolve was unshaken. This was my duty. The rest didn't matter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached our extraction point. My team had made it out safely, and we were ready to leave. But as we sat in the chopper, the adrenaline slowly leaving my body, I realized something. No one would ever truly understand the sacrifice I had made. Not my team, not anyone back home. They would never know the depth of my pain or the cost of the mission. They would only see the success, the result. And yet, in that moment, I understood something else, something deeper. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about applause. It was about knowing I had done what was right, even if no one ever saw it. As I sat there in that grand hall, surrounded by people who would never understand what I had been through, I realized that I no longer needed anyone's approval. I had lived my life by my own code, not by the standards of those who stood around me. I had sacrificed in ways they couldn't even fathom, and that was enough. My mind snapped back to the present, the noise of the crowd rising around me. I could feel the familiar tension in my shoulders, the weight of the world on my back. But now it didn't matter. I had learned that the truest form of strength wasn't about being seen. It was about holding firm in the quiet moments, in the spaces where no one else was watching. The room around me continued, but I was no longer a part of it. I had long ago stopped seeking approval. I had stopped needing anyone to validate me. I was strong not because of the medals on my chest or the applause that might come my way. I was strong because I had done the right thing, even when no one was looking. I had carried the weight of others and still kept moving forward, and that, I realized, was the quiet strength I had always possessed. The strength I had built on my own, with every sacrifice, every choice to move forward, no matter the cost. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself. And that was all that truly mattered. The night dragged on, the room filled with the noise of laughter and clinking glasses, but I found myself retreating further into myself. The surface-level conversations, the calculating smiles, the endless posturing, it all felt like a performance. I could see it so clearly now. The way people exchanged pleasantries, subtly positioning themselves for advantage, jockeying for the right connections, the right status. It wasn't new to me. I had been exposed to this kind of world enough times throughout my career. It was like a game of appearances, and I had never really been good at it. My life, my work, had always been about substance over style, action over talk. I had learned to live without the flashy rewards, the shallow validation that these people seemed to thrive on. As I sat there, I could feel the distance between me and everyone else widening. No one looked at me for long. They glanced, nodded politely, but quickly moved on. I wasn't part of their world, and they weren't part of mine. I had known that long before I walked in here tonight. But tonight, something about it felt even more pronounced, more obvious than ever. I watched the way people interacted, how they performed. The forced laughter, the carefully crafted compliments, the way they dressed and carried themselves like it was all part of some show. I glanced over at my family again. My mother was still holding court, surrounded by a group of people eager to get in her good graces. Clara was at her side, laughing in that way she always did. That easy, almost practiced laugh. They were playing their part so well. I didn't fit in. And I didn't care to. But there was something almost sad about it, wasn't there? The way they all pretended, performing for the approval of others, trying to climb to the next rung of the social ladder. I wondered if any of them truly felt content, or if it was all just an endless cycle of validation and competition. I had never understood the need for all of this, and yet I couldn't help but watch with a quiet, almost detached cynicism. It was like I was seeing them for who they really were. They didn't need each other. They just needed the illusion of needing each other. I looked over at Clara again, her smile never faltering as she charmed the latest person in her orbit. She was so good at this, so effortlessly good. But I wasn't jealous. I couldn't afford to be. What I had learned over the years was that there was no satisfaction in the game, no true fulfillment, just a series of hollow interactions, each one a stepping stone to the next. And for all her social climbing, Clara was still just Clara, my mother's golden child, always the star of the show, but never really seen. And that was the thing, wasn't it? They all performed, They all played their parts, but none of them truly saw each other. Not really. They only saw what they wanted to see, the image they wanted to project, the mask they wore to fit in. I wasn't interested in the game, and I certainly wasn't interested in the masks. A quiet, almost bitter laugh escaped me as I glanced down at my hands, hands that had held weapons, that had saved lives, that had endured more than most people could imagine. And yet, to them, I was just another invisible figure in the crowd. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of peace. The peace of knowing that I didn't need to be part of this performance. I didn't need to pretend to be something I wasn't. I didn't need to smile and play along, to posture or climb. I had done my part in the real world, had fought for what mattered, for what was right, and the recognition, the approval from these people was just irrelevant. So I continued to sit quietly, my eyes scanning the room as if I were watching a play, a well-performed, perfectly choreographed play. Everyone moving in unison, exchanging lines and rehearsed gestures, all for the sake of appearances. I was no longer invested in their act, and for the first time, I was completely fine with that. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, but as the event wore down, there was a shift in the air. A growing sense of anticipation hummed beneath the surface. The guests had begun to settle into their own little worlds, conversations ebbing and flowing with a dull familiarity. But something was about to happen. I could feel it, though I had no idea what it would be. I sat back in my chair, my gaze fixed on the stage, my mind adrift in the swirl of the evening's events. I had become adept at tuning out the noise, focusing inward, letting everything around me blur into the background. It was easier that way, less painful, less personal. Then, without warning, the room quieted as the event president, the same man who had introduced me earlier, took the microphone once more. His voice rang out, smooth and authoritative, the signal for another announcement. "And now," he said, a gleam in his eye as he addressed the room, "we move into the final part of our evening. The next speaker is someone who's been a quiet pillar of strength, someone whose actions speak far louder than their words. A person whose service and dedication are unmatched. Please welcome, once again, Colonel ELARA Monroe." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, the room seemed to vanish as my mind went completely still. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't meant to be in the spotlight again. The crowd's reaction, tentative applause mixed with murmurs, was like a distant sound, muffled as I tried to process the moment. The event president's smile was wide, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he looked over at me, clearly pleased with his choice. He didn't understand. He didn't see what I saw. He didn't know how much this moment stung, how much it cut through the thick layers of armor I'd built over the years. For a brief, heart-stopping second, I thought about refusing, about standing up and walking away. But I didn't. Instead, I stood up slowly, carefully, ignoring the dull throb in my knee as I made my way to the stage. I moved like I had before, but this time, there was no pain masking the tightness in my chest, the wave of unease that hit me like a physical force. I wasn't ready for this. The applause was louder this time, but it was different, more forced, more awkward. I could feel the stares, the attention. It wasn't real, and I could tell. This was not the kind of recognition I had earned. This was something else. A performance, a game. I stepped up to the microphone and adjusted it, my fingers gripping the edge of the stand as I stared out at the sea of faces before me. They were waiting. They were expecting something. The room was heavy with the weight of their expectations. But inside, I felt nothing but the sting of every previous moment of dismissal, every cut and insult, every quiet rejection that had led me to this point. For years, I had been silent, had stood in the background, had quietly endured. But now, in front of them all, I realized something. I didn't need to hide anymore. I cleared my throat and began, my voice steady. But there was an edge to it, one I hadn't intended, but one I could feel creeping into my tone. I didn't expect to be standing here tonight. Not like this, I started, my eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of some familiar faces. But here I am, and here you are. I paused for a moment, letting my words sink in. The silence in the room felt thick, like they were all holding their breath, waiting for the next line, the next bit of ceremony. But I wasn't playing their game, not anymore. "Some of you have known me for years," I continued, my voice quieter now, the weight of my words heavier. "Some of you have known me only for a few minutes. But the one thing I can tell you all with absolute certainty is this: I'm not here for the applause. I'm not here for the validation." The crowd shifted slightly, the applause dying down as I spoke. I could feel the shift in energy, but I couldn't stop. I needed to say it. I'm here because I've spent my life doing what was right, what needed to be done, even when no one noticed, even when no one cared. And that, for me, is enough. I swallowed hard, my gaze steady as I looked out at the sea of unfamiliar faces. Some looked confused, some looked uncomfortable, but I could see it in a few of their eyes. Understanding. Maybe not full understanding, but the hint of it, the realization that not everything was about appearances, about the kind of recognition they sought so desperately. I didn't serve for the applause, and I didn't make the sacrifices for the thanks, I said, my words ringing louder now, the bitterness in my voice almost unintentional, but it felt good to let it out. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And that, in the end, is the only thing that ever matters. I let the words sit there for a long moment, allowing the silence to speak louder than anything I could say. And then, I stepped away from the podium, my heart racing, but strangely calm. I didn't need their approval. I never had. The applause, slow at first, gradually grew louder. But this time, I didn't care. I wasn't standing there for them. I was standing for me. And for the first time, I realized that was enough. I left the stage, my heart still pounding, but a quiet satisfaction filling me. The evening, the recognition, the applause, it didn't matter anymore. I had said my piece. I had let them see me for who I truly was. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. I returned to my seat, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me, but I steadied myself. I didn't look around at the faces watching me. I didn't need to. I had said what I needed to say. Now the rest was just noise. For the briefest moment, the room seemed to quiet. The tension hung in the air, but I could already feel the weight of it shifting, something in the energy of the crowd changing. I had stepped off that stage, but in a way, I had also stepped into a new version of myself, one that wasn't afraid to speak out, to stop pretending that I didn't see the truth of things. I was done with being invisible. The murmurs continued, some applause still lingering. I didn't acknowledge it. I couldn't. It felt empty, forced, and that's not what I wanted. That wasn't the recognition I had come for. And then the next speaker, someone else whose accomplishments were recognized with the typical pomp and circumstance, stepped up to the microphone. I didn't pay attention to the words they were saying. I couldn't. I was still too lost in my own thoughts, processing what I had just done, the way I had spoken out for the first time in years, the way I had refused to stay in the shadows, in the background. In the midst of all the pretense and politeness, I felt free. But that didn't mean I was done. I wasn't about to sit there quietly for the rest of the evening. I couldn't. I glanced to my left, finding my mother seated at the table. I could feel her eyes on me, cold and assessing. She was probably wondering why I hadn't melted into the background like I always did, why I hadn't slipped back into the silence where I belonged, but I was done pretending. I looked away from her and surveyed the room instead. My mind, though still echoing with the weight of the words I had just said, also began to piece together the real reason I had spoken in the first place. It wasn't just about a few dismissive comments. It wasn't just about the way they had always treated me. It was about everything. The years spent working and sacrificing and doing what I thought was expected, all while no one ever truly saw me. Not as me, not as someone who had earned their place, not as someone who deserved to stand tall. The silence between us all had been suffocating for so long, but I had broken it. Finally, and then it hit me. It wasn't just the silence from them. It was the silence I had lived with for years, the silence I had accepted without ever questioning it, the silence that said I wasn't good enough unless I was useful to them, the silence that told me I had to keep proving myself in a world that would never truly understand me. I had given my entire life to this cause, this duty, and yet here, in this room, all I was seen as was a relic, a past relic whose medals were just decorations. No one had cared for the stories behind them, for the sacrifices, the real cost of what they represented. But now finally, I understood. I had been asking the wrong questions. I had been asking, why aren't they proud of me? When the real question should have been, why do I need them to see me? The next speaker finished their speech, and the crowd clapped politely, moving on to the next round of drinks, the next interaction. But I wasn't part of it. I wasn't part of the show. I was done with that. When the event president called for a break, signaling a shift in the evening's program, I stood up again. This time, I moved slowly, but purposefully. No more pretending, no more appeasing. I had earned my peace, and I wasn't going to let it slip away just because I had finally spoken my truth. I made my way to the back of the room, where the exit doors were just barely visible. It was a quiet place, a place where the world seemed a little less noisy, a little less full of expectations. I stopped just inside the threshold, standing in the doorway for a long moment before stepping outside. The air was cool against my skin. It was a strange contrast to the heat of the room behind me, the weight of the crowd, the pressure to perform, to impress. I didn't need to impress anyone anymore. As I stood there, breathing in the cool evening air, I felt something release inside me, something that had been stuck for so long. The feeling of weight lifting off my shoulders, of no longer caring about the approval I'd spent so many years seeking. I wasn't here for them, not anymore. This moment, standing outside in the quiet, was all mine. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know what would happen when I walked back inside, if I would be met with cold stares or polite indifference. But it didn't matter. For the first time in so long, I felt at peace, and that was enough. I stood outside for a few moments longer than I had intended, letting the cool night air fill my lungs and steady my racing thoughts. There was a strange sense of calm now, a peace I hadn't anticipated, the kind that only came after something monumental had shifted. I hadn't expected to feel anything like this, and yet it was real. The anger that had bubbled inside me for years, the resentment I had carried quietly, all of it had been released with just a few words. When I finally turned to head back inside, it wasn't with the same hesitation I had felt earlier. It wasn't with the fear of what they might think or how I might be judged. It was just me. The doors to the hall opened smoothly, and I walked back into the hustle of the event, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation. It all felt muffled now, like I was watching a movie where I didn't belong in the frame. As I made my way back to my seat, I caught a few glances, some curious, some uncomfortable, some outright dismissive, but this time, I didn't care. They weren't looking at me in the way they had before. They weren't seeing the woman who had given everything and received nothing. They were seeing someone who had finally given herself permission to be free. I didn't sit back down immediately. I stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, surveying the crowd with quiet detachment. I could see my mother, still in the center of her circle, her face slightly tight, a small frown tugging at the corners of her mouth. She was watching me, waiting for me to rejoin the scene, to be part of the performance again. But I wasn't going back in, not the way she wanted me to. A few moments later, the buzz of the crowd shifted as the event president returned to the stage. He was holding a microphone, ready to announce the next segment of the evening. The polite clapping began again, signaling that the flow of the night would continue without missing a beat. And yet, I couldn't help but notice that something had changed. Maybe it was just the way the crowd seemed to hesitate before the applause began. Or perhaps it was the way they were looking at me now, as if I had shifted in their eyes. Not just as a retired colonel, but as someone who had finally spoken her truth. The sound of my phone vibrating in my pocket cut through my thoughts. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. "Mom, we need to talk." I sighed, the familiar knot in my stomach returning, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I wasn't afraid of her or anyone else in this room. I hadn't been ready for the kind of conversation this night would bring, but I wasn't going to back down from it either. The screen buzzed again. "Clara, why did you do that? You embarrassed us." I felt the familiar sting of her words, but now, instead of retreating, I just stared at them. I didn't owe them anything, least of all an explanation. My fingers hovered over the keys, but I didn't respond. Not yet. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned my attention back to the room. The buzz of the crowd, the hum of polite chatter, it all seemed so hollow now. They were all still playing their parts, still performing their roles in the world of pretense. But for me, it was different. I wasn't part of their game anymore. I didn't need to be. After a few more moments, the event president's voice echoed through the speakers. And now we move on to the final part of the evening. It is with great honor that I introduce our next speaker. Please join me in welcoming. I barely heard the name. I barely cared. I had said what I needed to say. My truth was out there now, and no one could take it away from me. The rest of the night seemed to unfold in a blur. I didn't interact with anyone. I didn't engage in small talk. I just moved through the room like a shadow. My presence felt but unacknowledged. I was no longer chasing anything, no longer trying to fit into a mold that had never been mine. I was free. The evening finally wound down. The last speeches given, the final awards handed out. People began to gather their things, exchanging polite goodbyes. The room was slowly emptying, and I realized with a quiet sense of relief that I hadn't been caught up in any of it. I hadn't had to fake a smile or pretend that this world meant anything to me. As I moved toward the exit, I glanced once more at my family. My mother was still talking, still surrounded by her circle, but she looked up as I passed by. Her gaze met mine, cold, appraising, yet there was something else there. A flicker of something that might have been regret. Or maybe it was just annoyance. Either way, I didn't care. I didn't need her approval. Not anymore. I stepped through the door, out into the cool night air, the sounds of the event fading behind me. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight that had pressed down on my chest was gone, replaced with something lighter, something I hadn't known in a long time. Freedom. I glanced down at my phone again, at the unread messages from my mother and Clara, but this time, I didn't feel the need to open them. They could wait. I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their world of expectations. I wasn't their fool anymore. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, walking away from the life I had lived, the life they had tried to mold me into. The world was open before me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it on my own terms. I didn't need their validation. I had everything I needed already, and that was enough. The days following the event were strange, like the world had shifted just slightly out of focus. It wasn't just the recognition or the moment of vindication I had felt on the stage, it was something deeper. A peace had settled in, but also an emptiness. It wasn't about the applause, the attention, or the acceptance anymore. It was something far quieter, a sense of release, a letting go of the need to be seen in a world that would never truly understand. I returned to my life, the routine I had spent so many years building. The quiet strength I had embraced, the one I had discovered on that stage, had followed me home. But with that newfound peace came something else, a haunting sense of the years lost. Years I had spent seeking approval from people who would never see me for who I truly was. Years spent living for everyone else's version of success. Then one morning, a letter arrived. It was thick, heavier than the usual mail. The envelope was simple, unadorned, but the handwriting on the front caught my eye. To Colonel Monroe, I recognized the name immediately. I didn't know why it was addressed so formally. The man who had written it wasn't someone I'd ever expect to reach out. He had been a part of my life, a fleeting presence, someone I hadn't thought about in years. His name, scrawled in blue ink, brought a rush of memories I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Opening it, I felt a hesitation I hadn't anticipated. My heart pounded for a moment, my fingers pausing over the thick paper before I unfolded it. The letter began simply, but it was the words that followed that stopped me in my tracks. Dear Colonel Monroe, I hope this letter finds you well. I realize this is unexpected, and I hope I'm not intruding, but I've been carrying something with me for a long time now, something I never had the courage to say to you before. I'm writing to thank you. You probably don't remember me. It's been years, after all, but I've never forgotten what you did for me. Back when you were in the field, when we were stranded in that operation, you saved my life. I didn't know how to thank you then, but I've never stopped feeling that debt. You carried me when I couldn't stand, dragged me through that desert when I was barely conscious, and you never once let me down. You didn't have to. You could have left me. Everyone else had. I wanted you to know that your strength wasn't just for the mission. It was for me. And because of you, I'm here today. My kids know their father, and I get to hold them in my arms because you chose to push through. So many others might have given up, but you didn't. I don't know if this makes sense, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Thinking about everything you must have carried, how no one ever truly sees the weight of what soldiers like you do. I wanted to say thank you. I should have said it a long time ago, but I was too proud and too ashamed to admit the impact your courage had on me. I hope that wherever you are, you know that I haven't forgotten you, and I never will. With gratitude, Sergeant James Walker. I sat there in silence after I finished reading, my hands trembling ever so slightly as I set the letter down in front of me. The words, so simple yet so heavy, seemed to echo in my mind. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to feel. Gratitude? Relief? Even anger at how long it had taken for someone to acknowledge the quiet sacrifices I had made? But as I sat with it longer, I realized something. This letter wasn't just about James Walker. It wasn't about the past or the operation or the mission that had almost taken my life along with so many others. It was about what I had come to understand that night at the event. I didn't need their applause. I didn't need to be recognized by my family or the world. Because sometimes recognition comes from the most unexpected places. And it's the quiet, unspoken acts of strength that truly matter, the ones that no one else ever sees. I folded the letter carefully, setting it aside, and stood up. The weight of everything I had carried, everything I had been through, began to lift. I wasn't sure if James ever fully realized the impact of his words on me, but it didn't matter. I had already carried that weight for so long. It was enough. As I walked across the room, my eyes settled on the photo of my team, the one we had taken after the operation, the one with James standing beside me. The man I had saved, the man who had saved me, even if he hadn't known it. For a moment, I let myself remember. Not the pain, not the struggle, but the quiet strength of those moments when no one else was looking. When it was just about getting through, just about doing the right thing, even when no one would ever know. And that was enough. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and I took a deep breath before pulling it out. Another message from my mother. Another polite attempt to convince me to come back, to apologize, to be the daughter they always wanted me to be. I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the reply button. But instead of responding, I set the phone down. I didn't need to explain myself anymore, not to her, not to anyone. I walked to the window and looked out at the world beyond. I was finally at peace. My journey wasn't over, but I had come a long way. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had nothing left to prove. I had already done the hard work. Now, I could finally rest. The days that followed felt slower, calmer, like the world had softened its edges. The constant hum of daily life, the expectations, the noise, all seemed distant now, like background static fading into silence. I had grown used to this pace, this stillness, but now it felt different. It felt like I was choosing it, not just living with it. My routine had always been my anchor, and now more than ever, I appreciated its simplicity. I woke early every morning, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat in the same chair by the window, watching the light spill over the world. I'd never been a person who craved excitement or adventure. I'd spent enough of my life in the chaos of service, in the heat of battle, in the noise of the world. But now I understood the beauty of these quiet moments, the moments where I could simply exist. I had always defined myself by what I did, by the things I sacrificed, by the roles I played for others, but no more. The things that had once felt like weight had become the foundation of a peace I hadn't realized I was craving. And I finally understood that true strength wasn't just in what you did for others, it was in knowing when to stop, when to let go, when to step away from the noise and find clarity within yourself. The mornings were my sanctuary. I made it a point to savor them now, to take my time and appreciate the slow rhythm of life. I didn't rush through my coffee anymore. I didn't fill the silence with endless thoughts about the past or worries about the future. I simply was. And it felt good. There were still moments of reflection, of course. I would sit at my kitchen table, the steady tick of the clock in the background, and I'd remember. I'd remember the weight of those years, of service, of sacrifice. I'd remember the sting of rejection, the quiet dismissal, the way my family had never truly seen me. But now, I wasn't angry about it. I wasn't bitter. The memories were just that, memories. It was in these moments that I realized something profound. I didn't need my family to validate me anymore. I didn't need them to tell me I was worthy or important or valuable. I had already proven that to myself. There was power in that realization, a quiet, unspoken power that came not from shouting or demanding, but from simply being at peace with who I was. One afternoon, after a long walk along the tree-lined streets of my neighborhood, I came back to find a letter waiting on my doorstep. The envelope was plain, unmarked except for a familiar name. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the handwriting. It was from James. I opened the envelope carefully, pulling out the letter inside. It was short, simple, but it hit me harder than I expected. Colonel Monroe, I hope this letter finds you well. I just wanted to check in on you and let you know that I haven't forgotten what you did for me, for all of us. What you gave, what you sacrificed. It's something I'll never be able to fully repay. But I hope you know every day I carry that with me. I don't know if I ever told you this, but you saved my life, and I'll never forget it. You did more than just get me out of the field. You taught me what it means to keep going, even when the odds are against you. You taught me that true strength is quiet, and it's in the moments when no one's watching that the real work gets done. I wish you nothing but peace. With deepest gratitude, James Walker. I folded the letter slowly, my hand trembling just slightly. My chest tightened, but it wasn't the tightness of old grief or pain. It was the tightness of something else, of a kind of release, a moment of closure. James's words weren't just gratitude, they were a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the quiet acts of service, the ones that no one notices, the ones that are done without any expectation of recognition, are the ones that matter most. I sat down, the letter still in my hands, letting his words wash over me again. This was what I had needed. Not recognition from the people who would never see me, but from someone who had been touched by my actions, even if he hadn't fully understood them at the time. And in that moment, I realized that the quiet peace I had fought for all these years was finally mine. It wasn't dependent on anyone else. It wasn't something that could be taken away. It was something I had built for myself, one step at a time. The phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at it, seeing the message from my mother. She had tried to reach out again, of course. She had tried to pull me back into the fold with her words, her guilt, her expectations. I looked at the message for a moment, my finger hovering over the screen. But then I let out a breath and set the phone down. There would be no reply this time. Instead, I stood up, walked over to the window, and gazed out at the world. The same world that had once seemed so full of noise, of chaos. But now, it was just the world. Quiet, still, peaceful. For the first time in my life, I felt grounded. Not by duty, not by the expectations of others, but by my own understanding of who I was. And that, I realized, was enough. I was enough. I wasn't looking for validation anymore. I had nothing left to prove. And that, in itself, was the greatest peace I could ever find.